The year was 1889, and the Montana autumn was dying a slow, cold death. Wind, sharp as shattered glass, clawed at the small cabin nestled in a fold of the unforgiving land, its voice a constant, mournful keen around the eaves. Inside, Hannah Prescott moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned to measure life in the dwindling stack of firewood and the diminishing sacks of flour. Her world had shrunk to these four walls, to the rhythmic suckle of her 3-month-old daughter, Rose, and to the vast, aching silence left by her husband, Arthur. He had been gone since the first thaw of spring, taken by a fever that burned through him like a prairie fire, leaving her a widow in a land that offered little charity to lone women with babes in arms. Grief was a constant companion, a heavy cloak she could not shed. It was in the chill of the mornings when she woke to an empty space beside her, in the hollow echo of her own footsteps on the worn plank floor, in the sight of Arthur's tools hanging unused on the wall of the lean-to. But more pressing than grief now was a gnawing fear. Winter was a hungry wolf already sniffing at their door. The small vegetable patch had yielded little, the creek was running low, and the game seemed to have vanished from the surrounding woods. Rose was a healthy baby, thank the Lord, but her cries sometimes seemed to Hannah to be a desperate plea for a future. Hannah no longer knew how to provide. Months ago, in a fit of desperate hope that now felt like foolishness, she had penned a letter. Her fingers, stiff from mending and scrubbing, had struggled with the pen, pouring out her plight to Arthur's estranged elder brother, Owen Prescott, a man she had never met but knew lived on a substantial ranch down in Wyoming territory. Arthur had spoken little of him, and what he had said was tinged with a sadness that hinted at old wounds and deep disagreements. Still, he was family, Arthur's only living kin. She had entrusted the letter, along with the last of her meager savings for postage and goodwill, to a traveling peddler, a shifty-eyed man whose promises had felt as thin as the threadbare canvas on his wagon. She had watched him disappear over the rise, taking with him her last fragile ember of hope. No reply had come. The silence from Wyoming had been as profound and indifferent as the vast, empty sky. She had long since consigned that desperate plea to the ashes of forgotten dreams. One late afternoon, as the sun bled orange and purple streaks across the western horizon, painting the stark landscape with a fleeting, melancholic beauty, Hannah was nursing Rose by the meager fire. The baby's small, warm weight against her was a comfort, a tiny anchor in the sea of her anxieties. A sound, faint at first, then more distinct, cut through the omnipresent moan of the wind, the rhythmic plod of a horse. Her heart leaped into her throat. Visitors were rare, and often not welcome. Raiders, desperate drifters, or worse. She carefully placed Rose in her cradle, a sturdy box Arthur had fashioned, and reached for the old shotgun he had kept loaded above the mantelpiece. Her hands, though trembling slightly, were firm as she checked the breech. She peered through a crack in the shutters. A lone rider, slumped in the saddle as if exhausted, was approaching at a slow walk. He was leading a pack mule burdened with supplies. As he drew closer, she could make out a man of middling years, his face weathered and streaked with trail dust, a wide-brimmed hat casting his eyes in shadow. He didn't look like a threat, more like a man at the end of a very long road. But caution was a lesson hard learned in these territories. He stopped a respectful distance from the cabin, his horse sighing and dropping its head. He didn't dismount immediately, just sat there, looking at the cabin as if weighing his welcome. Finally, he swung a leg over the saddle, his movements stiff. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, raspy with dust and fatigue. "Mistress Prescott? Hannah Prescott?" Hannah's grip tightened on the shotgun. "Who's asking?" she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. "My name is Caleb Weston, ma'am." He gestured vaguely towards the pack mule. I heard you were in need. I brought some supplies." Hannah's mind raced. Weston? She knew no Weston. How could he know her name, her situation? Had the peddler gossiped, sold her story? "Heard from who?" she demanded, still hidden. He hesitated for a moment, shifting his weight. "A letter found its way to me. Spoke of a widow, a baby, hard times." He looked directly at the window now, as if sensing her presence. "Figured the least I could do was see if it was true, and if I could help." A letter, her letter, but it had been addressed to Owen Prescott. This was not Owen, this was a mistake, a dangerous one perhaps. Yet, The sight of those laden panniers on the mule, the promise of food, of something for Rose, it was a powerful lure. "What kind of supplies?" she asked, her voice still wary. "Flour, bacon, coffee, sugar," he listed. "And some tinned milk. For the baby. Read somewhere it could be mixed with boiled water and a little barley flour if mother's milk wasn't enough." Tinned milk. For Rose. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. For weeks, she had worried about her own strength, about whether her milk would remain plentiful enough as her own diet grew scantier. This stranger, this Caleb Weston, had thought of her child. Slowly, reluctantly, she unlatched the door, stepping out into the biting wind, the shotgun still held ready, though pointed towards the ground. She saw him more clearly now. Tired lines etched around his eyes, a grim set to his mouth, but nothing overtly menacing. His clothes were dusty and worn, but clean. His gaze was direct, steady. "The letter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was for Owen Prescott, Arthur's brother." Caleb Weston nodded slowly. "I know, ma'am." He didn't elaborate, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment before returning to hers. The secret of how and why he, not Owen, stood before her hung heavy in the air between them, as tangible as the coming cold. Hannah allowed Caleb Weston to stay, though her mind screamed against the imprudence of it. Necessity, stark and unforgiving, was her master. He could sleep in the small, derelict barn, a place barely fit for the scrawny milk cow Arthur had left her. She made that clear. He accepted without argument, his quiet demeanor a strange mix of deference and self-possession. He unloaded the supplies under her watchful eye, stacking them neatly in the lean-to. Sacks of flour and beans, slabs of bacon, precious tins of coffee and condensed milk. Even a small sack of oats, he suggested, could be ground for Rose's gruel. Each item was a small miracle, a reprieve from the gnawing dread that had become her constant shadow. The first few days were a silent, uneasy truce. Caleb rose before dawn, the sound of his axe ringing sharp and clear in the crisp air as he attacked the dwindling woodpile with a tireless energy. He mended a section of broken fence that had allowed their single cow to wander, patched a hole in the barn roof, and even managed to clear a blockage in the spring that had slowed their water supply to a trickle. He worked with a quiet competence, never asking for anything, his movements economical and purposeful. He ate the meager meals Hannah provided, mostly thin stew and hard biscuits, with a gravity that suggested he was used to faring worse. Hannah watched him from the cabin window, Rose often in her arms. Who was this man? His explanation for his presence was threadbare. Owen Prescott, he'd said when pressed, had been indisposed. Unable to make the journey himself, he had asked Caleb to come instead. It felt like a half-truth, a carefully constructed story that hid more than it revealed. Why would Owen, a man Arthur had described as hard-nosed and unsentimental, entrust such a mission to a hired hand, if that's what Caleb was? And why would this stranger undertake such an arduous journey, across states, for a woman he didn't know? His kindness felt like a debt she could not repay, and that in itself was unsettling. Rose, oblivious to the undercurrents of suspicion and unspoken questions, became an unwitting bridge. Caleb never approached the baby directly, never overstepped the invisible line Hannah had drawn. But sometimes, when he thought Hannah wasn't looking, she would see him pause in his work, his gaze resting on the small bundle in the cradle near the cabin door, if she'd brought Rose out for a breath of less stale air. A fleeting softness would touch his hard features, a shadow of an emotion she couldn't quite name, not just curiosity, but something deeper, more poignant. It was these unguarded moments that began to chip away at Hannah's reserve, tiny fissures appearing in the wall of her mistrust. One evening, a week into his stay, the wind rose to a gale, shrieking like a banshee and driving sleet against the cabin shutters. The temperature plummeted. Rose, who had been fretful all day, developed a dry, rasping cough, and her small forehead felt hot to Hannah's lips. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Hannah. The nearest doctor was in Miles City, a 2-day ride in good weather, an impossible journey now. She tried all the simple remedies she knew, a little honeyed water, keeping Rose warm, but the cough worsened, each small gasp tearing at Hannah's heart. Caleb, hearing the baby's distress from the barn where he'd taken to mending some harnesses by lantern light, appeared at the cabin door. his silhouette framed by the swirling snow. He held out a small, stoppered bottle. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. "This is an infusion of horehound and mullein. My mother used to make it for coughs. It's gentle, might help the little one breathe easier." Hannah hesitated. Another act of unexplained kindness, but Rose's labored breathing decided for her. She took the bottle, her fingers brushing his calloused, cold hand. The liquid was dark and smelled faintly of herbs and earth. She administered a few drops to Rose, her heart pounding. Caleb didn't intrude further, just gave a curt nod and retreated back into the storm. Through the long night, Hannah sat by the cradle, listening to Rose's breathing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the raspiness eased. The coughing fits became less frequent, less violent. By morning, Rose's fever had broken, and she was sleeping peacefully, a faint sheen of perspiration on her brow. When Hannah emerged from the cabin, red-eyed from lack of sleep but with a profound sense of relief, Caleb was already clearing a path through the newly fallen snow. She approached him, clutching her shawl tighter against the biting wind. "Mr. Weston," she began, her voice hoarse. He stopped his work, turning to face her. The medicine, it helped, thank you." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. He merely nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Glad to hear it, ma'am." He paused, then added, "Arthur, he was a good man. Spoke of this place, of you, with a fondness." Hannah stared at him, surprised. "You knew Arthur?" "Met him once, briefly, years ago, before he came up here." Caleb's gaze drifted towards the distant, snow-capped peaks. He was different from his brother. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in his wall of silence, a small offering of shared humanity. That day, when she served him his noon meal, she added an extra biscuit to his plate. He didn't comment, but she thought she saw a faint softening around his mouth as he ate. The days settled into a new rhythm, less fraught with suspicion, though still shadowed by unspoken things. Caleb Weston proved himself not just a capable worker, but a man of quiet decency. He never presumed, never complained. He repaired the water pump that had been failing, his strong hands surprisingly deft with the worn metal parts. He showed Hannah how to set more effective snares for rabbits, increasing their meager meat supply. He even spent an afternoon patiently teaching her how to properly bank the fire so it would smolder through the night, conserving precious wood and ensuring a warm cabin for Rose in the mornings. His past remained a closed book. He volunteered nothing about himself, about where he came from or where he was going. But Hannah began to piece together a sense of the man from his actions. He was clearly accustomed to hard work and solitude. There was a deep-seated weariness about him, not just physical, but something that emanated from within, a sorrow carefully contained. He was watchful, too. She often saw his gaze sweep the horizon, lingering on the trail that led down from the pass, as if expecting someone. The thought that he might be in some kind of trouble, that his presence might bring danger to her and Rose, still pricked at her, but the immediate, tangible benefits of his help, his steadfast presence, were slowly outweighing her fears. One afternoon, while Caleb was out checking his snare lines, Hannah found a small, crudely whittled bird on the windowsill beside Rose's cradle. Its lines were simple, yet it possessed a certain charm. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth, knife-hewn wood. Caleb must have made it. For Rose, a wave of warmth spread through her, unexpected and potent. This stoic, secretive man had a gentle heart hidden beneath his rough exterior. She placed the bird back carefully, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The uneasy peace of their isolated existence was shattered one brittle morning, a fortnight later. The sun was a pale disk in a steel-gray sky, and the air held the sharp bite of more snow to come. Hannah was inside, changing Rose, when Caleb's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the quiet. "Riders coming, Mistress Prescott, 3 of them." Hannah's blood ran cold. She hurried to the window, Rose clutched tight. 3 men on horseback were indeed approaching, moving at a purposeful canter up the narrow track towards the cabin. They were not drifters, they rode with an air of grim determination. Caleb was standing by the woodpile, axe in hand, his body tensed, watching them. His earlier watchfulness now made a chilling kind of sense. He had been expecting this, or something like it. The lead rider was a large man, expensively dressed despite the trail dust, his face florid and set in lines of arrogant displeasure. Even from a distance, Hannah felt a wave of dislike. As they drew closer, he reined in his horse, his cold eyes sweeping over the cabin, lingering on Hannah in the window with an unpleasant familiarity before settling on Caleb. "Well, well, Weston," the man called out, his voice carrying a sneer. "Thought you could just disappear, did you, with what's mine?" Caleb didn't reply immediately, his gaze steady on the man. "Owen," he said, his voice flat, devoid of surprise. Owen Prescott, Arthur's brother, the man she had written to in her desperation. He was here, not in answer to her plea, but in pursuit of Caleb. The truth of Caleb's evasions, the reason for his journey, began to dawn on Hannah with sickening clarity. Owen's lip curled. "Don't you owe me, you thieving hired hand. You took my money, Weston, and you'll pay for it." His gaze flicked contemptuously towards Hannah and Rose. "And what's this? Set yourself up quite comfortably, haven't you? Found yourself a little widow to take you in?" Rage, hot and fierce, surged through Hannah, momentarily eclipsing her fear. How dare he speak so of her, of Caleb's help? Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between Owen and the cabin. "The money was wages owed, Prescott, you know that. And I'm here because you wouldn't lift a finger for your own kin." "My kin?" Owen scoffed. "Arthur was a fool, always was, and she," he gestured dismissively at Hannah, "is nothing to me. You, however, are coming back to Wyoming. Now." One of his men, a brutish fellow with a scar across his cheek, shifted his rifle meaningfully. The air crackled with tension. Hannah's mind raced. Caleb had come because Owen had refused. He had used his own money Owen now claimed was stolen, to buy supplies for her and Rose. He had crossed states, faced hardship, not for personal gain, but out of a compassion his supposed employer clearly lacked. His secret was not one of malice, but of quiet heroism. And now, that heroism had brought danger to her doorstep. Owen Prescott dismounted, his heavy boots thudding on the frozen ground. He walked towards Caleb, his demeanor radiating menace. "I gave you a chance to come quietly, Weston. Don't make me get rough. It'll be worse for you, and maybe for your new friends." His eyes, cold and reptilian, slid towards Hannah and the baby in her arms. A primal fear, sharper than any she had known, lanced through Hannah. This man wouldn't hesitate to harm them to get what he wanted. But alongside the fear, a new resolve began to solidify within her, forged in the quiet respect she had developed for Caleb, and fired by the fierce, protective love for her child. Caleb stood his ground, the axe still held loosely in his hand, but his knuckles were white. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Prescott. My business here isn't finished." "Your business?" Owen laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your business is what I say it is. You work for me." "Not anymore," Caleb stated, his voice quiet but firm. Owen's face darkened with fury. "You insolent." He took another step, raising a hand as if to strike. "Stop." Hannah's voice rang out, surprisingly strong and clear, cutting through the tense standoff. She had moved to the doorway, the old shotgun now resting in the crook of her arm, its twin barrels pointed not directly at Owen, but in a way that left no doubt of her intent. Rose was still secure in her other arm. Owen and his men froze, their attention snapping to her. Surprise, then a flicker of something akin to respect, or perhaps just caution, crossed Owen's face. "This is my land, Mr. Prescott," Hannah said, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice steady. "Mr. Weston is here as my guest. At my invitation. You will not threaten him, and you will not threaten me or my child." Caleb shot her a quick, grateful glance, a spark of admiration in his eyes. Owen's eyes narrowed. "A shotgun, madam, against 3 armed men? That's hardly wise." "Perhaps not," Hannah conceded, "but I will protect my home and my child. Arthur left me this land, and I aim to keep it. And Mr. Weston has shown me more kindness and decency in a few weeks than you, it seems, have shown your own blood in a lifetime." A tense silence descended, broken only by the whistling wind and Rose's soft gurgle. Owen looked from Hannah's determined face to Caleb's unyielding stance. One of his hired men shifted uneasily, his gaze dropping from Hannah's unwavering stare. He hadn't signed on for a fight with a woman defending her babe. Owen Prescott was a bully, accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and the power of his wealth. He was not accustomed to such direct, fearless defiance, especially from a woman he clearly considered beneath his notice and a hired hand he thought he owned. He weighed his options, his florid face mottled with anger and thwarted pride. He could force the issue, but it would be messy. This woman, this widow, had fire in her. And Weston, damn him, looked ready to use that axe. Finally, with a curse under his breath, Owen spat on the frozen ground. "You'll regret this, Weston, both of you." He glared at Hannah. "Don't think this is over." He swung himself back into his saddle, yanking viciously on the reins. His men, looking relieved, followed suit. "Let's go," Owen snarled, and without another word, they wheeled their horses and galloped back down the track, their departure as abrupt as their arrival. Hannah stood in the doorway, the shotgun still ready, until they were out of sight. Only then did she allow her shoulders to slump, a wave of tremors washing over her. Caleb was beside her instantly, his hand gently taking the shotgun from her. "You were brave, Hannah," he said, his voice husky. "Braver than you should have had to be." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "He said you stole from him." Caleb met her gaze squarely. "He owed me wages for 6 months' hard labor. When I saw your letter, after he'd dismissed it, I knew I couldn't stay. I took what was mine, bought the supplies, and came. He considers it theft. I consider it justice." The cabin felt strangely quiet after the storm of Owen's presence had passed. The relief was immense, yet an undercurrent of tension remained. Caleb had defended them, and Hannah had defended him. They had faced a common enemy and stood together. Something profound had shifted between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of a bond forged in shared adversity. That evening, after Rose was asleep in her cradle, they sat by the fire, the silence between them no longer strained, but filled with a quiet understanding. The wind still howled outside, but inside, a fragile warmth had taken root. "Caleb," Hannah began softly, "why did you really come? It was more than just Owen's callousness, wasn't it?" He stared into the flames for a long moment, his face etched with old sorrows. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy with unshed tears. "I had a wife once, Hannah, Sarah, and a son, little Daniel." He would have been about Rose's age when his voice broke. He cleared his throat, struggling for composure. "Diphtheria took them both, 5 years ago now. It buried a part of me with them." He looked up at her, his eyes raw with remembered pain. "When I read your letter, saw your desperation, your love for your child, it was like hearing Sarah's voice, seeing Daniel's face. Owen's cruelty was just the spark. I couldn't stand by and watch another woman, another child, suffer alone if there was anything I could do. It felt like a chance to do something right. Something I couldn't do for my own." Hannah's heart ached for him. His quiet competence, his gentle ways with Rose, his deep-seated weariness, it all made a terrible, poignant sense now. He wasn't just a kind stranger, he was a man carrying a profound grief, a man who had seen her pain and recognized it as his own. She reached out, her hand covering his on the rough wooden table between them. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, "I am so sorry." He turned his hand, his fingers lacing through hers, his grip surprisingly strong, yet gentle. "It was a long time ago, but seeing you, your strength, and little Rose, it's been," he searched for words, "like a thaw after a long freeze." Their shared confessions, their mingled sorrows and newfound understanding wove a new tapestry in the small cabin. The threat of Owen Prescott still lingered, a distant shadow, but it no longer held the same power. They had faced him together. The secret Caleb had carried was now a testament to his profound empathy, his quiet courage. He was not the wrong cowboy, he was, in every way that mattered, the right one. Winter descended in earnest, blanketing the land in a deep shroud of white. But inside the cabin, there was a resilience that had not been there before. Caleb, no longer a temporary guest, worked with a renewed purpose, his skills and foresight making their small world more secure. He built a small, sturdy extension to the cabin, a room for himself, a tangible sign of his commitment to stay. He hunted with a quiet determination, ensuring they always had meat. Hannah, her spirit lightened by his presence and support, found herself humming as she went about her chores, her laughter sometimes mingling with Rose's happy coos. They rarely spoke of the future, but it was there, in the way Caleb's eyes would meet hers over the supper table, in the comfortable silences that settled between them as they sat by the fire in the evenings, in the way he would gently rock Rose's cradle when Hannah was busy. A partnership had formed, organic and unspoken, built on mutual respect, shared hardship, and a tenderness that was slowly, carefully, blossoming into something deeper. Spring arrived late that year, hesitant at first, then bursting forth in a riot of green. The creek swelled with melted snow, wildflowers dotted the meadows, and the air hummed with the promise of new life. Rose, now a sturdy, babbling toddler, took her first steps holding onto Caleb's calloused finger, her delighted shrieks echoing in the sun-warmed air. One afternoon, Hannah stood on the small porch Caleb had built, watching him mend a fence line at the edge of their pasture. Rose played at her feet, gravely examining a dandelion. The land, once a symbol of her isolation and fear, now felt like home, a place of sanctuary and burgeoning hope. Caleb looked up, saw her watching, and a slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes, chasing away the last vestiges of his old sorrow. He raised a hand in greeting. Hannah smiled back, her heart full. The desperate plea she had sent into the void had indeed been answered, not by the man she had expected, but by a stranger who had ridden across states with baby formula and a hidden wound. A man who had brought not just survival, but the unexpected, precious gift of a new beginning. The journey had been fraught with peril and uncertainty, but in the quiet strength of Caleb Weston, and in the resilient spirit of her own heart, she had found a haven. The wrong cowboy had, by some miracle of fate or providence, turned out to be exactly right.